On the first Monday of November, freezing rain lashed across Boston like driven nails, sealing the coastal roads beneath a layer of gray silence. In the last row of the number 9 bus bound for Marblehead, 27-year-old Delaney Boyd hugged a canvas bag holding everything she owned in the world. 2 changes of clothes, a picture frame turned face down, and 1 letter. Once she had studied cello beneath respected tutors, believing music could shape beautiful futures. Then a set of falsified ledgers, a jail cell in Nashua, and 2 funerals in 4 months stripped it all away, leaving only discipline, quiet kindness, and one thing she had never told anyone. She unfolded the letter for the 11th time, smoothing its creases with fingers gone rough from dishwater. Ashgrove House, 14 Harbor Lane, it read, seasonal housekeeper, 3 months, room and board included, just enough to keep her brother alive 1 more month. She whispered the address beneath her breath, determined not to disappoint the strangers generous enough to hire a woman, carrying nothing but her dignity and a surname this city had long since learned to spit out. The bus left her at the end of the road. She walked half a mile through the freezing rain, and when she finally looked up, 14 Harbor Lane was not a house. It was a gray stone estate built out on the point, walled all around, cameras turning to follow every step she took, and 2 men in black coats standing at the gate who did not bother pretending they weren't armed. The old butler opened it. He read the letter 3 times. His voice was very kind, and that was the worst part of all. Miss Boyd, this house has not advertised for a housekeeper. This house has not hired anyone from outside in 50 years. Delaney apologized 5 times. She said the mistake must surely be hers, because for 4 years now, everything had been hers. Then came a sound from the courtyard. A small elderly woman crossed the wet gravel, barefoot, white hair loose, green cardigan flying in the wind. A nurse ran after her, calling her name. The butler dropped the letter, leaving it forgotten on the wet gravel as he rushed forward. The old woman collided with Delaney and held on the way a drowning person holds a plank. And she spoke. That woman had not uttered a single word in 3 years. The doctors had given up. The entire household had learned to live inside her silence, the way one lives around a grave. And yet the first thing she said, after 1,095 days, was 4 words that froze every person in that courtyard where they stood. You came home. I waited so long. Delaney had never met this woman in her life. She was certain of it, but the old woman had not made a mistake. And at the top of the stone steps, a man in a black coat stood watching in silence, a man whose name all of Boston spoke only in a whisper, and for exactly 1 moment, before the mask could close again. He did not look like a boss. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. If this story reached you, leave a like. That's how you tell us to keep telling it. Share it with someone you think needs to hear it too. And don't forget to subscribe, because what's about to come out of that house will make you see everything you just heard in a completely different light. Sullivan Rourke stepped down the stone stairs without haste, as though freezing rain was something that only dared touch other people's shoulders. He stopped exactly 3 steps away from the 2 women. When he spoke, his voice was so polite that it felt hollow, the kind of politeness people use to close a door, rather than invite someone inside. He said that his mother sometimes mistook one person for another. He apologized for the inconvenience. He said that Miss Boyd must have had a very long afternoon. Then he knelt beside the elderly woman, slowly and carefully, like someone approaching an animal that had been wounded far too many times, and held out his hand. The moment his fingers brushed the sleeve of her blue sweater, an inhuman sound escaped from somewhere deep within Maeve Rourke's chest. She recoiled at once, drawing herself against Delaney as though retreating behind a stone wall. Sullivan pulled his hand back as if he'd been burned. For exactly half a second, the mask cracked, and what surfaced beneath it wasn't anger. It was something far worse than anger. The 2 men standing by the gate turned their heads in perfect unison before immediately looking away, as though they had just witnessed something that could cost them their jobs. Or perhaps something far more valuable than that. The red-haired nurse hurried forward and draped her own coat over the elderly woman's shoulders. Then she slipped off her shoes and placed them gently upon the rain-soaked gravel before the old woman's bare feet, which had already begun turning purple from the cold. She did it with rough hands and a tenderness that no one could ever teach. The old butler leaned close to Delaney and spoke softly enough that his voice barely carried through the sound of the rain. He said that she hadn't done anything at all. Not for 3 years. Not a single word, not a single sound, not even once. Delaney didn't know what to do. She was 27 years old. She was kneeling on wet gravel in the courtyard of a house where she had no right to be. A stranger was clinging to her, as though she were the last remaining piece of driftwood from a ship that had sunk long ago, and Delaney had nothing to give her. She had no money, she had no home. She didn't even have a family name that people were willing to speak aloud. The only thing she still possessed was a melody, so she hummed it, very softly, almost nothing more than breath given shape. It was a wordless song that her mother used to hum while washing dishes in their cramped kitchens in Somerville, a sound Delaney had heard for more than 20 years, without ever thinking to ask what it was called. And the old woman fell silent. Not gradually, immediately. Like a needle settling perfectly into its groove, the entire courtyard stood motionless. The nurse lifted a trembling hand to cover her mouth. The butler didn't bend down to pick up the letter lying at his feet. Maeve Rourke let out a long, weary breath. Then she fell asleep, right there, resting against the shoulder of a woman she had never met, beneath the freezing rain of early November, her hand still clutching the edge of Delaney's coat, as though letting go would make the entire world disappear all over again. Sullivan Rourke stood there, drenched from head to toe, his black hair plastered to his forehead, his coat heavy with rainwater. He was the man whose name was spoken throughout Boston in whispers. He had sat across from men who could have killed him without blinking even once. Yet he stood before this moment, with nothing at his disposal. There was no command that could fix it. There was no name he could call upon. There was no amount of money he could pay. He could only stand there and watch his mother sleeping on the shoulder of a stranger for the first time in 1,095 days, and he couldn't understand why. Then he turned toward the old butler. He didn't ask who Delaney was. He didn't ask where the letter had come from. He asked only one question, so quietly that only the old man standing beside him could hear it. There was something fractured in his voice at the end of the question. Something the old butler hadn't heard in 50 years. He asked what song that was. Ambrose Pike opened his mouth. Then he closed it again, because he knew exactly what song it was, because he knew who had once sung it in this house, in a room with a grand piano, 50 years ago. But he simply straightened his back, stared into the falling rain, and said, "I don't know, sir." It was the first time in 50 years of service that Ambrose Pike had ever lied to Sullivan Rourke, and though the letter lay drenched upon the wet gravel, its ink slowly beginning to bleed, Ambrose quietly retrieved it before following them inside, keeping the rain-soaked proof of the 7 words he had written with his own hand. Maeve slept for 11 minutes, and during those 11 minutes, no one in the courtyard dared to move. Delaney knelt upon the wet gravel, her knees numb, icy water soaking through the thin fabric of the only decent dress she still owned. And she didn't dare breathe too deeply, for fear that the rhythm of her breath might awaken the fragile peace that had only just arrived. The red-haired nurse, whom Delaney would later learn was named Odette Vasari, finally slipped an arm gently beneath the old woman's back, doing so with the practiced ease of someone who had lifted this woman into her arms no fewer than 1,000 times before. But Maeve wouldn't let go. Her fingers remained tightly wrapped around the edge of Delaney's coat, and each time Odette tried to loosen her grip, those fingers tightened even more, though she remained asleep, and though there wasn't a single sign of consciousness upon her face. Odette looked up, and for the first time that afternoon, someone in that house looked directly into Delaney's eyes instead of looking through her. She said that Delaney would have to come inside, adding that she was very sorry, but if they tried to remove Maeve's hand now, she couldn't say what might happen. Delaney turned instinctively toward the old butler, searching for permission, a nod, anything that would allow her to cross the threshold she had been denied only 15 minutes earlier. But Ambrose Pike wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Sullivan, and Sullivan Rourke was staring at his own hand, his right hand, the one with 3 old broken knuckles that had never fully straightened, opening and closing it, over and over again, as though checking whether it still worked after his own mother had rejected him before 19 household staff members and 2 gate guards. Then he finally spoke. He said that Miss Boyd would come inside. He didn't say please. He didn't offer an invitation. He simply stated a fact in the same manner one might announce the weather, and immediately 4 people sprang into motion. One opened the front door, One hurried away to fetch blankets. One disappeared toward the kitchen. Another picked up Delaney's canvas bag without asking her a single question. Delaney realized that in this house, that man's voice didn't require volume. That frightened her far more than the two guns at the gate. They carried Maeve into the small sitting room on the first floor, where a fireplace glowed beside an old armchair, worn deeply into the shape of the person who had occupied it for years. Delaney sat carefully on the edge of the chair, Maeve's hand still clutching her coat, and with the first warmth she had felt in hours, she began to tremble, not because she was cold. She trembled because her body was finally allowed to understand that it had walked 800 meters through freezing rain, that she hadn't eaten since morning, and that the job that was supposed to keep her younger brother alive for one more month had just vanished at the hands of a polite old gentleman. Odette placed a cup of tea into her hands. She didn't say a word, but she carefully observed the way Delaney's fingers wrapped around the cup, the way they trembled, the way she swallowed the first sip too quickly, and burned her tongue without making a sound. Odette Vasari was 44 years old. She had once had a son. She knew exactly what hunger looked like in someone who refused to call it hunger. She quietly left the room, and when she returned, she carried a plate of bread and sliced meat that no one had asked for. Outside in the hallway, Ambrose Pike stood beside Sullivan in the shadows between two wall lamps. He waited. 50 years of service had taught him that when this man chose silence, the only proper response was to remain silent longer. At last Sullivan spoke, his voice calm in the way a lake is calm when everyone knows it is 30 meters deep, asking who had sent the letter. Ambrose replied that he would find out. Sullivan asked how many people in the house had known in advance that she was coming. Ambrose answered that, to the best of his knowledge, no one had. Sullivan nodded once, and Ambrose understood that he didn't believe him. He also understood that Sullivan knew he knew that. Then Sullivan spoke one final sentence before turning away, and the old butler had to strain his ears to hear it. He said that for the past 3 years he had paid 7 doctors, 2 neurological specialists in New York, and 1 man in Zurich who charged $60,000 for a single week. He said that not one of them had managed to make his mother speak a single word. Then a stranger had knelt in the freezing rain and hummed something, and she spoke. He stopped there. And Ambrose Pike heard something in that voice that he hadn't heard since 22-year-old Sullivan had once stood in this very hallway asking him where his sister was. Sullivan then asked whether Ambrose believed in things like this. Ambrose replied that he believed in what he saw, sir. Sullivan didn't answer. He walked toward his study, leaving Ambrose standing alone in the darkness between the 2 lamps. The old man pressed his hand firmly against his chest, where his heart had begun beating out of rhythm, and told himself that he was an old man now, that he didn't have much time left, and that in any case, what had needed to be done had already been done. Outside in the courtyard, beneath the wet gravel, a piece of paper lay there with 7 words slowly dissolving into the rain. No one picked it up. And that was the only thing that happened that night, exactly as he had planned. The old woman finally released her grip just before 9 o'clock that evening, when her sleep had become deep enough for her fingers to forget what they had been holding. Odette carried her upstairs to the 3rd floor, with the effortless gentleness of long practice, leaving Delaney alone in the small sitting room, with an empty teacup and a plate of bread she had eaten down to the very last crumb. Without even remembering when she had finished it, she stood up. She smoothed the wrinkled fabric of her coat where the old woman's fingers had clung to it. She searched for her canvas bag, stepped into the hallway, and thanked the old butler 5 separate times. She thanked him for the tea. She thanked him for allowing her to come inside and escape the freezing rain. She thanked him for reading her letter 3 times instead of once, because she had learned to be grateful even for the smallest kindnesses that other people wouldn't bother to notice. She said that she was sorry for all the trouble she had caused. She said she would walk back to the main road, that there was probably still one last bus running, and that she hoped Mrs. Rourke would recover soon. Then she turned and took 3 steps toward the front door. Ambrose Pike called her name. His voice was just as kind as it had been earlier that afternoon, carrying that same velvet softness. Delaney had lived long enough during the past 4 years to know that kindness was the most dangerous thing anyone could offer her, because it never gave her enough time to raise her defenses. He told her that there was a rule in this house, Those who entered were permitted to do so. Those who left needed a reason. Delaney stood perfectly still, one hand resting on the strap of her bag, and smiled politely, almost absent-mindedly, because she assumed it was simply an old man's joke, the sort of joke one politely laughs at to avoid appearing rude. Then she saw his face, and her smile slowly faded. The way a candle dies when it runs out of wax, rather than when it is blown out. He offered no further explanation. He didn't need to. He merely shifted his gaze toward the far end of the hallway, where the dining room door stood slightly ajar. Delaney followed his eyes and saw 4 men seated around a long table beneath the warm glow of yellow light. 4 faces. None of them were eating. There was no food upon the table, only paperwork and a cell phone lying face down. One of the men lifted his head and looked directly at her through the narrow opening of the door. He didn't look away. He simply watched her with calm patience, the kind of look that belonged to someone committing a face to memory. And Delaney finally understood, about 5 hours later than she should have, that she had just seen 4 faces she was never supposed to see. That was why the security cameras at the gate had followed her every step. That was why the 2 armed guards outside hadn't even bothered concealing their weapons. Not because they were careless, but because the decision that she would see them had already been made for her. She took a step backward. Ambrose quietly closed his eyes, and for the briefest half-second, something resembling genuine pain crossed his face, something Delaney would remember for a very long time before she finally came to understand what it meant. Sullivan appeared at the end of the hallway. He had changed his clothes. His dark hair was still damp, and he held a cup of coffee in his hand that he hadn't touched. He told her that she had 21 days, until Thanksgiving. She would work here. She would be paid a salary. When he stated the amount, Delaney had to ask him to repeat it, because the number was greater than everything she had earned during the previous 2 years combined. She would stay in the room on the east side of the house. She would care for Mrs. Rourke. And she would ask no questions whatsoever about anyone in this house. Delaney listened to every word. Then she asked a question in a quiet voice that didn't tremble. And that was the moment Sullivan Rourke truly looked at her for the first time. What if I refuse? He didn't answer immediately. He studied her for so long that the grandfather clock at the end of the hallway had time to strike once. Then he said that he advised her not to. And he walked away. There wasn't a single thing in his voice that sounded like a threat. That was precisely the problem. That same night, inside the study on the 2nd floor, a file sat upon Sullivan Rourke's desk for 6 hours. It had been prepared by someone in Quincy in less than half an evening, and delivered in a manner that left absolutely no trace. Delaney Ann Boyd, 27 years old, no criminal record, no contact whatsoever with law enforcement, including during the investigation involving her father, even when she had been asked to provide testimony and had simply replied, "No thank you, I have nothing to say." Studied cello at the New England Conservatory before leaving during her 3rd year. 31 jobs over the past 4 years, none lasting longer than 4 months. One younger brother, Juan Boyd, 19 years old, 412. Sullivan skimmed through the report with the indifference of a man who had read thousands of files just like it. His eyes moved effortlessly from line to line, until the final line on the 3rd page. Mother, Cora Boyd. Deceased in 2022. Residential address from 1976 through 1978. 14R Homerber Lane, Marblehead, Massachusetts. Sullivan Rourke sat perfectly still for 20 minutes. He didn't move. The coffee in his hand had gone completely cold. Then he picked up the internal telephone and asked Ambrose Pike to come to his study. The old butler entered and stood before him. Sullivan didn't invite him to sit down. He didn't ask a single question. He simply sat there with one hand resting upon the open file, turned to the 3rd page, and looked at him. 9 minutes. The clock upon the wall counted every passing second. Ambrose Pike stood with his back perfectly straight, exactly as he had done for 50 years inside that room. And he never once glanced down at the paper, because he knew that looking down would be a confession. At last, Sullivan closed the file, and said that was all. Ambrose bowed his head. He left the study, and gently closed the door behind him. He walked the length of the hallway, descended the staircase, and returned to his private room. Only after the door had closed behind him did he finally allow himself to look down at his own hands. They were trembling. They had been trembling for all 9 of those minutes. hidden behind his back, where no one could see them. Ambrose Pike locked the door to his private room, something he hadn't done once in 50 years of living in this house, and stood with his back against it until his hands finally obeyed him again. Then he walked to the old writing desk in the corner of the room, lowered himself to his knees with all the weariness of a 78-year-old man, and pulled open the bottom drawer. Inside was nothing but the papers of a lifetime spent in service, leather-bound ledgers recording household expenses from the days before anyone in this family knew how to use a computer. And at the very bottom, pressed between two pieces of stiff cardboard, lay an envelope. He took it out. He opened it with the care of a man removing a bandage from his own wound. Inside was a letter printed on fine paper, complete with an official heading and the signature of a legitimate property management company in Salem. Ashgrove House, Marblehead, a 3-story vacation home located exactly 4 miles from where he was kneeling, owned by a retired couple living in Florida, entirely legal, entirely harmless, entirely the sort of place where a 27-year-old woman could spend 3 months working as a temporary housekeeper before leaving with a paycheck and not a single scar upon her life. He had changed exactly 7 words written in his own hand, using ink he had carefully chosen to match the original, on a copy he had printed at the public library in Lynn on a Tuesday afternoon, while wearing a hat and carrying no phone. 7 words that had carried Delaney Boyd 4 miles and 48 years away from where she was supposed to go. There was a knock at the door. He didn't answer. The knock came again before the doorknob turned, and he remembered that Odette Vasari was the only person in the house who possessed keys to every door, because she was also the only person who might need to open any of them at 3 o'clock in the morning. She stood in the doorway with her red hair hastily tied back, still wearing the same clothes from earlier that afternoon, damp at the shoulders from the rain. She looked at him kneeling upon the floor. She looked at the envelope. Then she asked him what in God's name he was doing, Ambrose. He didn't hide anything. That was the strangest part of all. He simply folded the letter slowly along its familiar creases and placed it back inside the envelope. Before telling her that Delaney hadn't come to the wrong house, Odette, he had merely made certain that she found the right one. Odette quietly closed the door behind her. She stood there for a very long time, and when she finally spoke, her voice no longer carried the loud Brooklyn edge everyone in the house had grown accustomed to. It was small and dry as she asked whether he understood what he had done. He had brought a woman into this house. He had allowed her to see the 4 faces seated in the dining room. Did he understand what that meant? Ambrose sat down upon the edge of his bed. He removed his glasses and wiped them with the edge of his shirt before beginning to tell her the truth. 3 years earlier, on the night Mr. Rourke died, the house had been full of people, and not one of them had been where they were supposed to be. The doctor had been downstairs. Sullivan had been in Providence, driving home at a speed that should have killed him, somewhere along Route 128. Odette had been standing in the hallway making phone calls, and Ambrose Pike had been alone in the room, holding the hand of a woman who hadn't spoken more than 10 sentences to him in any given year for 40 years. She opened her eyes. She looked at him. She gripped his wrist with a strength that no 70-year-old woman who had just watched her husband die upon the floor should have possessed, and she whispered 4 words. "Find Cora's daughter." Then she let go, and she didn't speak another word for the next 1,095 days. Odette stood frozen in silence. She asked who Cora was. Ambrose told her that he hadn't known. He hadn't known for 6 months. He had searched through everything in the house, every ledger, every photograph box, and eventually he found the name recorded in the household payroll book from 1974, written in the handwriting of the butler who had served before him and died long ago. Cora Boyd. Arrived in September of 1974. Left in June of 1976. No reason given, no letter of recommendation. Only a single line drawn through the final column, and for 40 years not a single person in this house had spoken that name aloud even once. It took him another 4 months to find her daughter. Then he waited for 2 years. Odette asked what he had been waiting for. Ambrose Pike put his glasses back on and looked directly into her eyes before saying the one thing he knew would change the way she looked at him forever. He had been waiting for Delaney to become desperate enough to accept a job offered by a stranger. He told her that he had watched Delaney's father die inside a jail cell in Nashua, and done nothing. He had watched her mother die 3 months later and done nothing. He had sat in his car across the street from the hospital and watched Delaney walk out after signing the admission papers for her younger brother. And he had counted every one of the 17 minutes she stood alone in the parking lot without knowing where to go next. And he hadn't stepped out of his car. He told Odette that he hadn't saved anyone. He had only waited, because only after falling all the way to the bottom would someone willingly walk through a gate like the one outside. Odette Vasari said nothing for a very long time. Then she asked in her familiar Brooklyn voice, rough and direct once more, what would happen if Sullivan found out. Ambrose Pike reached over and switched off the desk lamp. In the darkness, his voice was perfectly calm. He said that he was an old man now, and that he had carried that boy in his arms before he had even opened his eyes for the first time, and that Sullivan wouldn't kill him. He paused. Then he quietly added 3 more words, softer than before, and those words lingered in the darkness, long after Odette had left the room. I think so. On the first day, Delaney Boyd learned that no one in this house laughed out loud. People laughed from time to time, but it was the sort of laughter compressed inside the chest and released softly through the nose, laughter that had been trained never to travel farther than 3 meters. On the second day, she learned that the household staff called Sullivan Rourke Sir, not young master, not Sullivan, not anything else, simply Sir. The 72-year-old woman who ironed clothes, who had been here since before he could walk, called him Sir as naturally as breathing, and Delaney understood that this wasn't a rule anyone had written down. It was something that had simply grown inside this house over time, like moss. On the third day, she ate her first dinner with the staff. 19 people sat around a long table in the basement dining room and ate in silence, and it took Delaney nearly the entire meal to realize that the unusual thing wasn't the silence, but the seating arrangement. No one sat with their back facing the door. Every chair had been positioned so that the person sitting in it had a wall behind them and a clear view of the entrance. When she accidentally sat in the only remaining seat, the one facing away from the hallway, the man beside her, a gardener not yet 30 years old with a gentle smile, quietly stood up and exchanged seats with her without saying a word or even looking at her. That sentence chilled Delaney more deeply than anything she had seen in the courtyard on her first day. On the 5th day, she discovered the locked room. It stood at the end of the 2nd-floor hallway with a dark wooden door and no nameplate. The lock wasn't old but new and polished, installed long after the house had been built by someone who couldn't care less whether it matched the rest of the architecture. She asked the old butler about it, and Ambrose Pike simply said that the room didn't require cleaning, Miss Boyd, in his customary gentle voice. Delaney had already learned that whenever he sounded kindest, the conversation was over. But the thing that held her attention the longest wasn't inside the main house. It was inside the storage room behind the kitchen, where she had been sent to fetch additional tablecloths. There, stacked neatly against the wall, sat more than a dozen cardboard boxes labeled in careful handwriting, ceramic pumpkins, maple wreaths, amber candles, large tablecloths, autumn porcelain plates. Across the opening of every box ran a strip of yellowed packing tape that remained perfectly intact, untouched and uncut. Delaney brushed a finger across the thick layer of dust and left a clean line behind. She stood there for a long time. Ambrose appeared quietly behind her. She had no idea how long he had been standing there. He told her that Mrs. Maid used to cook for 40 people, Miss Boyd. He said that she baked everything herself, chose the flowers herself, and hand-wrote every guest's name on the small place cards resting upon their plates. He said that for the past 3 years, there hadn't been a single Thanksgiving dinner in this house. Then he stopped and searched for the right word, only to find the saddest one of all. He said that now they simply ate dinner. Caring for Maeve became Delaney's responsibility on the 6th day, and Odette handed over her instructions as though presenting a battlefield map. Mrs. Maeve only ate when music was playing, any music at all. Even the radio would do. Without it, the spoon would stop halfway to her mouth and never continue its journey. The sound of doors closing caused her to withdraw into silence for long periods of time, which was why every door in her suite had been fitted with rubber padding 3 years earlier. She didn't like anyone standing behind her. She preferred sitting beside the 3rd-floor window overlooking the bay and could remain there from 8 o'clock in the morning until sunset without changing position. Every day after lunch, she performed a single ritual. She pulled a small tray closer and carefully arranged the spoons and forks upon it. She did it slowly and precisely, placing each piece according to some private order known only to herself, adjusting them repeatedly until the distance between them satisfied her. Then she leaned back and studied the tray for a long moment with the expression of someone who had just completed something deeply important. Afterward, she cleared everything away. The next day, she began again from the beginning. Delaney asked Odette what she was doing. Odette replied that no one knew. The doctors had called it repetitive behavior, something perfectly ordinary. Delaney watched those aged hands place a spoon upon the tray, with the same care one might use when laying flowers upon a grave. She said nothing, but she didn't believe it was ordinary at all. Then there was the name. Maeve called her Nell, not just once. Every morning when Delaney entered the room, she greeted her with that name, in a voice filled with relief. The kind of voice people use when they discover that something precious remains exactly where it belongs. Nell, open the window. Nell, come sit here. Nell, are you cold? Delaney endured it for 3 days. On the 4th day, at 5 o'clock in the evening while standing in the kitchen, she asked Odette who Nell was. Odette was pouring coffee. She didn't stop. She finished pouring it, set the coffee pot down, and slid the cup toward Delaney, performing every movement much more slowly than necessary. Then she looked up and quietly told her not to ask that question in this house, sweetheart. Afterward, she turned away and began washing dishes, turning on the faucet louder than she needed to. Delaney stood there holding her cup of coffee while, 3 floors above their heads, an elderly woman sat by the window overlooking the bay, waiting for lunchtime to pass, so that she could once again arrange her spoons and forks. Delaney called her younger brother every evening at 8 o'clock, always from the bend in the 2nd-floor hallway, the only place in the house with decent reception and no one around. She always remained standing rather than sitting, because sitting down would make the conversation last longer, and the longer it lasted, the more she would hear hidden beneath his voice. Rowan Boyd was 19 years old, and he had learned to speak to his sister in a language built entirely out of jokes. That evening, he told her that the doctors had measured something in his back again, that they had used the same word they always used, the kind of word that sounded as though they were discussing the weather. Then he laughed and said that at this rate, he would probably become a robot one day. Half handsome young man and half titanium. He asked whether she thought he would get to pass through airport security for free. Delaney laughed. She laughed for real. She laughed louder than this house would ever allow. Rourian laughed with her on the other end of the line. And for 3 brief seconds, the Boyd siblings were children once again in the cramped kitchen in Somerville. Then Rowan asked whether she had received this month's paycheck yet, and something in his voice shifted ever so slightly. Only slightly. But it was the sort of change that only the person who had raised him since he was 15 years old could ever hear. She told him she had. She told him everything was fine. She told him to get some sleep, then she hung up. She stood there holding her phone before sitting down upon the staircase. And she didn't cry. That was the strangest thing of all. Something she had realized about 2 years earlier. Somewhere between the first funeral and the second, she had lost the ability to cry. Tears were a luxury that required believing someone would come when the crying was over. So she simply sat there. She looked down at her hands, fingers hardened by work in all the wrong places, and did what she did every night. She calculated $9,400 a month. Her salary here covered 21 days. How many days remained? How much money was still missing? She calculated it twice, and both times arrived at exactly the same number. Both times, it wasn't enough. At the top of the staircase, standing in the darkness between 2 wall lamps, Sullivan Rourke was watching her. He had been standing there for 3 minutes. He had come upstairs to retrieve something, and stopped when he heard laughter. Loud laughter. The kind of laughter that had not existed within these walls for 3 years. So he had remained where he was and listened. He heard her voice change when she said that everything was fine. He heard the silence after she ended the call. He looked at the way she sat there on the staircase, her shoulders perfectly still, not a single sob escaping her. He was a man who had spent years sitting across from people crying and begging inside the room at the end of the 2nd-floor hallway. Yet he had never seen anything that unsettled him quite as much as a woman who sat there grieving without tears. He said nothing. He turned away and walked downstairs using the back staircase, the servants' staircase, something the master of this house had not used once in 14 years. The following morning, a single sheet of paper rested upon the small table in her room in the east wing. Nothing else, no envelope, no note, no signature beyond those already printed upon the document. Delaney picked it up and read it. Then she read it again, then a third time. Not because it was difficult to understand, but because it was almost impossibly easy to understand. It was a debt transfer agreement, every medical debt registered under Rowan Boyd's name, every unpaid hospital bill, every account already transferred to debt collection agencies, every dollar that had accumulated over 4 years, until Delaney had stopped looking at the total amount and looked only at what was due each month. All of it had been purchased outright from the hospital by a corporate entity called Harborline Holdings. Entirely legal, properly notarized. The agreement had been signed yesterday. And in the lower corner, inside a small accounting box, was the amount the hospital had accepted for the sale. 42 cents on the dollar. Delaney found Sullivan in his study at 7:15 that morning. She didn't knock. She placed the document upon his desk and told him that he had just bought her brother. Sullivan didn't immediately look up. He finished writing the line before him, set down his pen, picked up the document, folded it neatly along its original creases, and told her that he had purchased the debt. He said there was a difference. Delaney asked what that difference was. Sullivan Rourke didn't answer. He simply looked at her. There was no evasion in his pale green eyes, no discomfort, none of the expressions of a man caught doing something he shouldn't have done. There was only honesty. Because there was no difference. Because he knew there was no difference. For 30 years, this house had survived by purchasing debts and giving them different names, and he had grown up inside it. He had learned very early in life that the line separating helping someone from owning them was no thicker than a single signature, and the only person who ever decided where that line existed was the one holding the pen. He handed the folded document back to her. She didn't take it. He placed it upon the edge of the desk nearest her, and picked up his pen to continue writing. That was his answer. Delaney stood there for another 10 seconds before quietly walking away. She returned to her room. She closed the door. Then she sat down upon the edge of her bed with the document still in her hands, and realized something that would take her many weeks to finally put into words. Before yesterday, she had been an employee. She could leave. She would go hungry. She would lose everything. But technically, she could walk through that gate. Beginning today, every single day she remained in this house carried a price written somewhere inside a ledger she would never be allowed to see. That night, Delaney Boyd, who had spent 4 years calculating every dollar of her existence, who had learned to survive by turning everything into numbers, because numbers didn't hurt, took out the small notebook where she recorded her expenses. She opened it to a blank page. At the top, she wrote a single number, 1, day 1. Then she began counting. On the 9th day, Delaney was sent to find a wool blanket in the storage room in the west wing, and she opened the wrong door. The room she stepped into wasn't a storage room. It was spacious, with a high ceiling and 3 large windows overlooking the bay. Everything inside was covered in white sheets. The shapes beneath them stood silently, like a gathering of people, waiting for something that had failed to arrive long ago. Dust drifted through the gray light, pouring in from the windows, thick enough that Delaney had to cover her nose with her hand. She meant to step back. She had already taken 1 step toward the door. Then she saw the shape in the corner of the room. It was the kind of shape anyone who had spent 15 years of their life beside it would recognize even beneath a white sheet. That curve, the neck rising beneath the fabric like a graceful throat lifted toward the light. Delaney Boyd stood motionless in the dusty room and felt her heart do something it hadn't done in 4 years. She hadn't intended to touch it. She kept telling herself that as she crossed the wooden floor. She told herself she would only look, only pull back the sheet a little, only satisfy her curiosity. Then she touched it. The white cloth slipped to the floor, revealing an old cello, its wood darkened beautifully with age. There was a long scratch across its back, the kind that only years of devoted playing could leave behind. The strings were still intact. Someone had replaced them once, and never returned to play again. She sat down beside it without ever consciously deciding to sit. She drew the cello between her knees. and her body remembered everything her mind had tried so hard to forget. The way her shoulders relaxed, the angle of her chin, the way her right elbow softened so that the bow could float rather than press. She placed the bow upon the strings, and she played. The first sound was dreadful, a terrible screech that made her wince. She tried again. It was still terrible. The fingers that had once known exactly where to press now slipped uncertainly across the strings. The calluses on her hands sat in all the wrong places. The calluses of 4 years spent washing dishes rather than 15 years spent mastering an instrument. By the 8th note, the tip of her index finger split open, and a thin line of blood stained the D string. She didn't stop. She played badly. She played terribly, worse than a first-year student. Her bow trembled. Her timing faltered. And she played the only melody she didn't need sheet music to remember, the wordless song her mother used to hum while washing dishes in their cramped kitchen in Somerville. The same melody she had softly hummed beneath the freezing rain 9 days earlier, without giving it a second thought. Then she heard it, from the 3rd floor, through the ceiling, through 3 stories of wood and stone in a house built to keep every sound from escaping. A voice, wordless, nothing but a melody, fragile and trembling and old, as paper beginning to crumble with time. Perfectly in tune, every single note. Delaney stopped her bow in midair and sat frozen, and during those 3 seconds of silence, the voice upstairs stopped as well, waiting, as though it couldn't quite believe what it was hearing. Then Delaney placed the bow upon the strings once more and continued playing. The voice immediately joined her again, never missing so much as a fraction of a beat. The 2 melodies intertwined through an entire verse, and somewhere upstairs, a 76-year-old woman was singing a song she had no reason to know. There came the sound of footsteps racing down the staircase. Odette Vasari nearly stumbled into the room, one hand gripping the banister while the other covered her mouth. She stopped in the doorway of the music room and couldn't speak. Tears streamed down her face, and she didn't wipe them away. She had spent 3 years of absolute silence caring for that woman. She had washed her face, trimmed her nails, read the newspaper aloud to her through hundreds of quiet mornings without ever receiving a single word in return. And there she stood, listening, unable to explain it to anyone, unable to explain it even to herself. Then another figure appeared at the doorway. Sullivan Rourke stood there. No one knew how long he had been watching. He didn't step inside. He looked at the cello. He looked at the thin streak of blood upon the string. He looked at the woman playing so badly it ought to have hurt his ears. And upstairs his mother was singing. He asked one question. "What's the name of that song?" It was the first thing he had ever said to Delaney Boyd that wasn't an order, an arrangement, or an announcement of a decision that had already been made. It was simply a question, from a man who genuinely didn't know. Delaney told him that she didn't know. She said that her mother used to sing it. She said that her mother couldn't read or write and had never written it down, and that she herself had never thought to ask. Sullivan said nothing more, but he didn't leave. He stood there in the doorway with one hand resting against the wooden frame, his right hand with its 3 crooked knuckles that would never fully straighten, and remained there until she finished playing. 4 minutes. He stood in the hallway of his own house, for 4 entire minutes, listening to someone play terribly. And during those 4 minutes, no telephone was permitted to ring. No one dared walk past the doorway. 19 people throughout the house stood perfectly still wherever they happened to be, because none of them understood what was happening. When the final note faded into silence, the singing from the 3rd floor faded with it. Then Delaney heard the sound of a chair sliding softly across the floor and slow footsteps moving away. The old woman returned to her place beside the window overlooking the bay, just as she did every day. That night, the light in the 2nd floor study remained on until morning. The night guard saw it glowing at 2 o'clock, then again at 4, then at 6. He didn't say a word to anyone because in this house, people didn't speak unless they had to. Upon the desk beneath that solitary lamp lay an open file turned to its 3rd page. Beside it sat a cup of coffee gone completely cold, and there was a name, written by hand upon a blank sheet of paper, by the man who had sat there throughout the entire night. He wrote it once and stared at it, then wrote it again on the line beneath it, as though repeating the name might somehow persuade it to answer him. Cora Boyd. Cora Boyd. Cora Boyd. On the 11th day, Odette took half a day off to see her dentist, And for the first time, Delaney found herself alone in the third-floor suite for an entire morning. Mrs. Rourke sat by the window overlooking the bay, as quiet as she was every day, and Delaney decided to do something Odette had been putting off, because it usually required 2 people. She was going to change the bed linens. She lifted the mattress. It was heavier than she expected, and as one corner rose from the wooden frame, something slipped out and fell onto the floor face down. Delaney bent over and picked it up. It was a photograph, an old printed photograph with worn, rounded edges, the kind developed at a photo shop rather than printed at home, the kind that had been picked up and put down thousands of times by hands that had never quite dried. She turned it over. It showed a Thanksgiving dinner from a lifetime ago. The long dining table in the first-floor dining room, the very same table, the very same windows. Only then, the tablecloth had been amber-colored. There were candles and flowers and an absurdly large turkey resting proudly in the center. 4 people sat around the table. A man stood at its head, silver-haired and broad-shouldered, one hand resting upon the back of a chair, with the easy confidence of someone who owned both the room and everything within it that breathed. Maid sat beside him, decades younger, her hair still brown and laughing. Delaney had to look twice before recognizing her. Not because of her hair, but because that smile simply didn't belong to the woman she had spent the past 11 days caring for. A young man sat to her left, perhaps 20 years old, thinner than he was now, with black hair. Everything else about him had changed over the years, but Delaney recognized those eyes immediately. And then there was the 4th person. A young woman sat to Maeve's right, ash-brown hair falling over her shoulders, tall and slender, one hand resting lightly upon the tablecloth. Delaney saw the hair. She saw the shape of her shoulders. She saw the gentle way her hand rested upon the table. Then she looked up to where the woman's face should have been. There was nothing left. The photograph had been scratched until the paper had torn into fibers. Someone had clawed at it with fingernails over and over again, digging so deeply that the white paper beneath the photograph had been exposed and then scratched away as well. Only one face had been destroyed. The other 3 remained untouched. Her father had done it a cold, systematic erasure of a daughter who dared to speak, leaving the ruined picture behind before Maeve saved it. Delaney stood there for a very long time, holding the photograph while listening to the sound of blood rushing through her ears. Then she heard movement behind her. The old woman had left her seat by the window. She stood only 1 step away, and Delaney hadn't heard her approach. Maeve Rourke looked at the photograph in Delaney's hands. She didn't snatch it away. She didn't panic. She simply raised one finger and pointed toward the ruined face. Then she slowly turned that finger and pointed toward Delaney. And she spoke the name, Nell. Then she turned around, returned to her chair by the window overlooking the bay, and sat quietly for the remainder of the morning without another word. Delaney found Ambrose Pike in the silver room, polishing a set of silverware no one ever used. She placed the photograph upon the table between them. He didn't look at it. He looked at her for a very long time, and Delaney saw something there that she had seen once before in the hallway on the night. He had explained the rules of the house to her. Something that looked very much like genuine pain. He set down the polishing cloth. He told her that she shouldn't ask. Delaney replied that she cared for Mrs. Rourke every single day, that the old woman called her by that name every morning, and that she would continue doing so for another 10 days. He could allow her to do all of that without knowing the truth. But if he did, then he wasn't employing her, Mr. Pike. He was using her. Ambrose Pike stood silently for several moments. Then he pulled out a chair and sat down, and it was the first time in 11 days that Delaney had ever seen him sitting. He began to tell her the story. Nell was Maeve's daughter, Sullivan's older sister, 2 years older than him. She died in 2012. Delaney asked when. He said 14 years ago. 3 days before Thanksgiving. That year, the dining table had been prepared the day before. The amber tablecloth had been laid out, the candles arranged, handwritten place cards placed upon every plate. When the news arrived, no one took anything away. The table remained exactly as it was. 3 days passed, then 4, then an entire week. On the 9th day, Ambrose himself cleared the table at 4 o'clock in the morning because no one else in the house could bear to watch another person do it. Officially, it had been a car accident. Wrote 127 rain. No witnesses. The state police had closed the case within 11 days. Delaney asked what had happened unofficially. Ambrose looked out the window. He told her that 3 weeks before her death, Nell Rourke had met with someone in Boston. Not a lawyer, the other side. She was 22 years old, and she believed that if she told the truth, everything would stop. She intended to testify against her own father. Delaney asked who had given the order. For a very long time, Ambrose didn't answer. Then he spoke quietly. The man in the photograph. The one standing at the head of the table with his hand resting upon the chair. It had been him. Delaney asked who had carried it out. The old butler spoke a name Delaney had already heard twice during her 11 days in the house. The name belonged to the heavy-set, red-faced man who laughed loudly and had politely greeted her in the hallway on Tuesday. Grady Finnegan. Delaney placed one hand upon the edge of the table. She asked Arnfinkelkinen very softly, "And Mrs. Rourke? Did she know?" Rose Pike answered that she did. "For how long?" The old man continued staring out the window before giving an answer that seemed to drain all warmth from the room. 14 years. He told her that Maeve had known since the very first week. She knew and sat down to breakfast with her husband the very next morning. She knew and welcomed guests into that very sitting room for 14 years. She knew and cooked Thanksgiving dinner for 40 people every November. She wrote every guest's name upon every place card with her own hand, and throughout those 14 years, she never told a single soul. Then her husband died, and she stopped speaking. Delaney stood there in the silver room, surrounded by 20 polished place settings gleaming beneath the light, and looked once more at the photograph. And suddenly she understood the thing that sent a chill down her spine. They had told her that the old woman suffered from dementia. The doctors had all said so. 7 doctors. 2 specialists in New York. 1 man in Zurich who charged $60,000 a week. But Maeve had been carrying that suffocating secret for 14 years before the illness ever arrived. The illness hadn't taken away her voice. She had abandoned it herself long ago. She had buried herself alive inside her own home. And the illness had merely arrived much later, almost mercifully. Like the final blanket someone gently lays over a person who has spent 21 winters lying out in the cold. It hadn't stolen anything from her at all. It had simply given her an excuse. Sullivan Rourke sat alone in his study that night. He wasn't writing, he wasn't reading. An unopened bottle of wine rested on the desk before him beside 2 crystal glasses. He didn't look up when Delaney passed the open door, but he spoke her name, and she understood immediately that he had been waiting. In this house, he knew what passed through every hallway and at what hour. She stepped inside. He gestured toward the chair across from him. She sat down. He opened the bottle and filled both glasses to the brim, and for the next 40 minutes neither of them took a single sip. The wine was only there to give their hands something to do. He told her that Ambrose had spoken to him about their conversation in the silver room that afternoon. Delaney said she knew he would. Sullivan slowly turned his wine glass in a circle upon the polished wood. Then another. He said that Ambrose had gotten one part of the story wrong. Delaney waited. Sullivan said that Ambrose had told her Nell was 22 years old and believed that if she spoke the truth, everything would stop. He said that was true. But Ambrose hadn't told her the rest. 3 weeks before that night, Nell had come to him, not to their mother. Not to Ambrose, to him. He was 20 years old then. His sister had sat on the edge of his bed in his room on the 2nd floor and told him she had met someone in Boston. She told him she had already shared part of the truth and was about to reveal the rest. Then she had looked at him and asked a simple question. "Would you come with me?" Sullivan set his wine glass down. He said he told her she had lost her mind. He told her she didn't understand anything, that their father would never do such a thing, that she was imagining someone else and not the man who had taught her how to ride a bicycle. He said his sister sat there in silence for a very long time before rising and walking out of his room. 3 weeks later, she died on Route 127. It was raining. There were no witnesses. Delaney said nothing. Sullivan stared into the untouched wine in his glass and said that on the night of her death, when the phone call came, he had been standing in the hallway, downstairs, and overheard his father speaking on the telephone. Something in his father's voice was wrong. It wasn't the voice of a man who had just lost his daughter. It was the voice of a man confirming that a task had been completed. He said he heard it when he was 22 years old, and in that moment he knew. He knew completely. He knew exactly. and what he did afterward was return to his room and close the door. The next morning, he sat down and ate breakfast with his father. He continued doing that for 11 more years until the old man died. Then he took his father's seat. He slowly turned the wine glass once more before speaking the sentence Delaney would remember for a very long time. He said that for 14 years he told himself he didn't know. Then he looked at her and said that pretending not to know something you know perfectly well is a full-time job, Miss Boyd. It consumes all of your time. It demands that you rearrange your entire life around it. It forces you to choose which door to walk through, which questions never to ask, which people to keep inside your house, and which ones to push far away. He said he had paid the price for that choice every single day for 14 years and had never once stopped long enough to calculate the total. Delaney folded her hands in her lap. Then she began her own story. She told him her father's name was Thomas Boyd. She told him he had worked as an accountant for a small company in Quincy for 19 years. He was the kind of man who wrote down every dollar he spent on coffee. When she was 12 years old, he made her return a pencil she had accidentally brought home from school. She told him that when she was 23, people arrived at their home at 6 o'clock in the morning. 4 months later, her father died in a jail cell in Nashua. 3 months after that, her mother suffered a stroke in their kitchen, and Delaney was the one who found her. Her mother lived for 11 more days and never spoke another word. Sullivan didn't move. Then Delaney told him the part she had never told anyone. Before the authorities sealed their home, she had taken her father's case file from the cabinet. She opened it in the kitchen at 2 o'clock in the morning and read every page. There, she found an authorization signature on an account her father had never possessed the authority to open. It wasn't his signature. She sat staring at it for nearly 40 minutes. Then she closed the file. She placed it at the bottom of her closet and hadn't opened it once in the 4 years since. Sullivan asked her why. Delaney answered simply, "Because I was 23 years old, and I was afraid." He replied that she was still afraid. She said, "Yes, I am. I'm afraid every single day. I'm afraid when the telephone rings at 3 o'clock in the morning in this house. I'm afraid whenever I walk past the locked room at the end of the hallway. I'm afraid every time my brother calls me, and I hear that slight change in his voice." Then she lifted her eyes and looked directly at him. "But you've stopped being afraid a long time ago, Mr. Rourke. You're afraid of no one. You sit inside your own house, surrounded by 19 people, 2 gates, and a ledger I'm not allowed to see, and there's nothing in this world that frightens you, and you've still remained silent." She paused, then she asked him which was worse. Sullivan Rourke didn't answer, and looked at her without a single word to offer. In that silence, Delaney heard the grandfather clock downstairs strike 2 o'clock. He didn't touch her. She didn't touch him. They sat separated by a wooden desk no more than 3 feet wide, with 2 full glasses of wine and an open bottle neither of them had ever intended to drink. When Delaney finally rose to leave, he didn't walk her to the door, and both of them knew that this had been the closest they had ever come to one another. Closer than anything that might happen afterward, because for 40 minutes, 2 accomplices in silence had looked at each other, without illusion, and neither of them had looked away. On the 13th day, Odette Vasari declared that if Delaney ate one more silent dinner in the basement, she would personally nail that dining table shut. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, she dragged Delaney into the kitchen, carrying a bag of lamb and her mother's yellowed recipe book. Her mother was a Brooklyn woman who had taught her to make Irish stew when she wasn't even tall enough to reach the kitchen counter. She said that no one in this house had cooked anything for anyone in 3 years, sweetheart. People only reheated food prepared by somebody else and carried it upstairs to their rooms. And that wasn't eating, that was refueling. A house that only refuels itself is nothing more than a morgue with a fireplace. Delaney began chopping onions. She chopped slowly and evenly because 4 years of washing dishes in restaurants had taught her that if you chop slowly, you don't cut your fingers. Standing beside her, Odette cheerfully complained that she chopped onions like she was defusing a bomb. For heaven's sake, just hack the whole thing. Ambrose Pike appeared at the kitchen door at 4:20 in the afternoon, dressed in his usual black suit, and asked in the gentlest voice imaginable if something was happening here. Mrs. Vasari, Odette handed him a carrot and a knife and told him to sit down. The butler stared at the carrot in his hand for about 5 seconds, with the expression of a man who had just been assigned a duty that had somehow never appeared in 40 years of his job description. Then he sat down, and he peeled. Everything went remarkably well for about 40 minutes. Then Odette remembered she had forgotten to buy bay leaves. She hurried upstairs to the pantry and told Delaney to keep the stew simmering over low heat. Delaney turned the gas knob down. Except the knob had been broken for years, and nobody had bothered fixing it because no one had used it in 3 years. The flame remained exactly as high as before. While Ambrose was telling her some story about marinating lamb, the bottom of the pot began doing what pot bottoms inevitably do. Smoke appeared then, more for smoke. Then the fire alarm system of this house, installed by the same people who designed security systems for government buildings, decided that this was precisely the moment to demonstrate its value. Everything that followed lasted exactly 11 seconds. The kitchen door flew open, then the hallway door, then the back door. 19 people appeared in the kitchen almost simultaneously from 3 different directions, moving with an efficiency that suggested they had practiced this scenario many times before. Not one of them said a word. Delaney stood in the middle of the smoke, holding a wooden spoon with a kitchen towel draped over her shoulder. Ambrose Pike stood beside her, holding half a peeled carrot, and 19 people stood there staring at the two of them, at the pot billowing black smoke, at the screaming fire alarm. In those 3 silent seconds, Delaney saw the exact same expression on all 19 faces. And then she laughed. She couldn't help it. She laughed that impossibly loud laugh of hers, the one this house had practically outlawed for the past 3 years. She laughed so hard she had to brace herself against the kitchen counter. Tears streamed down her face, and she simply couldn't stop. Odette came running downstairs, took one look at the scene, and burst into laughter herself. Her loud Brooklyn voice filled the kitchen as she threw open the windows and cursed the broken gas knob, with words that Ambrose pretended very hard not to hear. Then Ambrose Pike carefully set down his half-peeled carrot. He rose to his feet. He wrapped the kitchen towel around the pot handles with great solemnity, standing perfectly straight and wearing an expression of complete dignity. Then he carried the blackened pot through the middle of the 19 men, who silently stepped aside for him. He walked across the kitchen and out the back door slowly and ceremoniously, like a man carrying the coffin of an old and beloved friend. Then a sound came from the hallway doorway. It was dry, soft. It sounded like old paper being gently crumpled inside someone's hand. The entire kitchen fell silent. Maeve Rourke stood there with one hand resting against the doorframe. At some point, without anyone noticing, Odette had already hurried to her side. Maeve was watching Ambrose and the burned pot, and she laughed. No one in that house had heard that sound in 1,199 days. 19 people stood frozen in place. The young gardener, who had once exchanged seats with Delaney at dinner, turned his face away and rubbed his eyes, pretending the smoke had irritated them. At the end of the hallway, standing in the shadows, Sullivan Rourke was there. He had come downstairs when the alarm sounded, just like everyone else. He stopped when he heard the first laugh. He didn't step inside since he simply stood there with one hand resting against the wall and listened to his mother laughing. And he didn't allow anyone to see his face in that moment. That evening, after everything had been cleaned up and everyone had eaten sandwiches instead of dinner, Odette sat on the back steps outside the kitchen, holding an unlit cigarette. She looked at Delaney and said, "Sweetheart, if you're capable of burning down this kitchen, then you're capable of setting that table." Delaney asked which table. Odette didn't answer. She simply looked toward the storage shed. Delaney went down there, shortly before midnight, carrying a pair of scissors borrowed from a desk drawer. She stood in front of the line of cardboard boxes stacked against the wall for a very long time. Much longer than necessary. Her hand trembled as she raised the scissors. She was afraid, truly afraid, the kind of fear that comes when you know you're about to do something that cannot be undone. Then she cut. The yellowed packing tape gave way with the softest sound. 3 years of dust rose into the pale light of the single overhead bulb. Inside, carefully wrapped in old newspaper, was a neatly folded stack of amber-colored tablecloths. On the 14th day, Delaney called her brother that evening. She didn't tell him about the burned stew or the laughter because 4 years had taught her that, whenever she shared something happy with Rowan, he would ask questions. and if he asked questions, she would have to tell more lies. But that night, she asked him something she hadn't asked in 4 years. She asked if their father's case file still existed. There was silence on the other end of the line for so long that she thought the call had dropped. Then he said yes. He told her that when the house had been sealed, he took everything from the bottom drawer and scanned every page into digital files 2 years ago while he was in the hospital. He used his old phone and scanned a few pages each day whenever he couldn't sleep. Delaney asked why he had never told her, and Rowan Boyd, 19 years old, spoke to his sister in a voice she had never heard him use before. "Because I knew you wouldn't open it," he said. "I was waiting for you to ask. I've been waiting for 4 years." The files arrived in her inbox at 9:40 that evening. Delaney sat on the edge of the bed in her room, in the east wing with her laptop resting on her knees, and watched the download bar slowly crawl from 0 to 100%. During those few moments, she thought about many things. She thought about her father's hand resting on her shoulder at the train station when she left for college. She thought about the time he made her return a pencil she had accidentally taken home when she was 12 years old. She remembered that he had driven 15 minutes to take her back to school, because he told her that a person only has one thing worth losing, and it isn't money. She thought about the jail cell in Nashua that she had never seen but had imagined thousands of times. Then she opened the file. She began reading from the very first page. She read all 311 pages over the next 3 hours without skipping a single one, including the pages she had only glanced at 4 years earlier. This time, however, she was reading them through the eyes of someone who had spent 14 days living in a house where people bought debts and simply gave them different names. Now she understood those lines. Now she understood why one company in Quincy transferred money to another company in Lawrence, only for it to circle back again. She understood that money doesn't travel in circles unless someone needs it to look like something else. She realized that her father had recorded everything meticulously and precisely. 19 years of recording every dollar, and that meticulous honesty was what had killed him. Because people don't allow men who keep records that well to live with what they know. Then she reached page 267. It was a copy of an account authorization form, bearing an official bank stamp and dated March of 2019. The account belonged to a corporation. The authorizing signature belonged to her father. She recognized his small, slanted handwriting immediately, and below it, in the space for the authorized individual, was a bold and sweeping signature. The kind written by a person who had signed it thousands of times without ever imagining that anyone would stop to read it. G. Finnegan. Delaney sat perfectly still. She had seen that signature once before, 4 years earlier, at 2 o'clock in the morning in the kitchen of their apartment in Somerville. Back then, she didn't know what the name meant. It was only a name. It could have belonged to anyone. Now it belonged to a heavy-set man with a flushed face who had passed her in the first-floor hallway on Tuesday. He had smiled politely and asked whether she was the new girl. Now it belonged to the name Ambrose Pike had spoken in the silver room when she asked who had done it. She sat there for a very long time. The grandfather clock downstairs struck 1 o'clock. Then she closed the laptop. She placed it beside her on the bed and sat in the darkness, listening to the voice that had spoken to her for 4 years. It was a reasonable voice, the voice that reminded her that she still had Rowan, that she still earned $9,400 a month, that she was 27 years old and possessed almost nothing. "Close it again," the voice whispered. "You closed it once before and survived." She sat with that voice for nearly 10 minutes. Then she thought of a woman upstairs who had listened to that same voice in her own head for 21 years and obeyed it. A woman who had paid for that silence by burying herself alive inside her own home. A woman who now spent every afternoon arranging silverware upon a tray according to a pattern no one else could understand. Delaney Boyd opened the laptop again. For the first time in 4 years, she chose not to remain silent. She worked until 4 o'clock in the morning. She photographed every important page with her phone and saved the files in 3 different places. One was a new email account she created that night. One was an online storage account. The third she sent to Rowan with only one instruction: do not open. Just keep it. Then she walked downstairs to the butler's small office where everyone printed grocery lists and household schedules using an old printer. She printed 41 pages. The most important 41 pages. The printer was painfully slow and embarrassingly loud inside a sleeping house. Every mechanical groan made her heart skip a beat. She carried the pages back to her room. She clipped them neatly together. And then she did the one thing that no one in that house would ever fully understand, the thing both Sullivan Rourke and Ambrose Pike would later mistake for the carelessness of an exhausted young woman. She placed the stack of papers into the bottom drawer of her dresser. Unlocked. She didn't hide them beneath her clothes. She didn't conceal them inside the lining of her suitcase. She simply placed them inside the bottom drawer. The very drawer any housekeeper would open while replacing drawer liners. The very drawer Odette Vasari opened every Friday to put away fresh towels. Then she closed the drawer and went to bed. Delaney Boyd had survived 4 years by calculating everything, by turning every tragedy into numbers, because numbers don't hurt, and she had calculated this decision just as carefully as she calculated everything else. She was 27 years old. She had no lawyer. She had no money. She had no one to call, and she was living in a house she wasn't permitted to leave. There was nothing she could accomplish on her own with 41 sheets of paper, but there was one person in that house who could, and she had no way of handing those pages directly to him, so she left them where they would eventually find their own way into his hands. That wasn't carelessness. It was the only move available to someone in her position, and she lay awake until dawn, wondering whether that made her any different from the people who lived in this house. The conservatory stood at the far end of the garden, a structure of glass and iron built in an age when this house belonged to other people. For the past 3 years, no one had set foot inside except the young gardener, who came once a month to water things that had long since died, simply because no one had ever told him to stop. Delaney discovered it on the afternoon of her 15th day, while searching for a vase to arrange a few dried maple branches she had taken from one of the cardboard boxes the night before. The air inside was damp and cold, and smelled faintly of old earth. Rows of pots lined both sides of the room. In every single one sat something that had once been alive, a plant reduced now to brittle gray stems standing upright in dry soil. Delaney walked slowly between them, and thought she had never seen a place as sorrowful as this. A room built entirely of glass to welcome sunlight for things that no longer needed light. She was crouching beside a faded paper label, whose words had long since disappeared, when the glass door behind her opened. Grady Finnegan stepped inside. He seemed to fill most of the doorway, and he was smiling before he had even crossed the threshold, the same warm smile he had given her once before in the hallway that Tuesday. "Oh," he said cheerfully, "someone's in here. I thought this place had died for good." Hands tucked into his pockets, he wandered over at an unhurried pace and stopped 2 steps away from her, surveying the dead plants with the expression of a man visiting a cemetery he knew well. "Maeve used to grow things here, you know," he said. "Tomatoes in the summer, flowers in the winter." He chuckled softly. She was convinced she could grow roses in January in Massachusetts. And her husband? Well, he let her try. Never told her no, not once in 40 years. The laugh that accompanied his words sounded warm and genuine. There was nothing overtly wrong with it. Then he asked if she was the new girl. Delaney said yes. He asked her name. She gave it. "Ah," Grady Finnegan said with an approving nod. "Boyd." He pronounced her surname a little more slowly than the rest of his sentence. Then he asked, almost casually, "You have a younger brother, don't you?" Delaney went still. He continued speaking in that same warm, grandfatherly tone, the voice of an older relative making pleasant conversation over dinner. He named the hospital. Got it right. He named the 4th floor. He named room 412. "Poor kid," he said, shaking his head sympathetically. "Only 19. He's got his whole life ahead of him." Then he sighed. "Hospitals these days, you know, Miss Boyd. They're short-staffed. Nurses work 3 shifts back to back." He gave a small shrug, looking almost mournful in his sincerity. "Accidents happen all the time." Delaney said nothing. She couldn't. For 3 full seconds, she couldn't even remember how speaking worked. Grady Finnegan looked at her, still smiling, and didn't wait for an answer, because he had never actually asked her a question. Then he reached out and patted her shoulder twice, lightly. The gesture of an older man offering encouragement to a young woman, a gesture he had probably performed hundreds of times over the past 40 years. It was warm, and his hand was heavy. Delaney stood perfectly still beneath that weight and did not move. Just keep taking good care of the old lady, he said kindly. She likes you very much. Then he turned and left. The glass door closed softly behind him. He never once looked back, because looking back is something people do only when they are uncertain. Delaney remained standing among the dead plants for a very long time. Her hands were cold. Only then did she realize she was still holding the empty vase. She carefully set it down because she was afraid she might drop it. And then the memory came not like a thought, but like nausea rising in her throat. The memory she had spent 4 years refusing to touch. Another room. An afternoon in April, 4 years earlier. 11 days after they had come to her house at 6 in the morning. An office on the 9th floor of a building on Federal Street. Another kind man, gray-haired, wearing glasses, pouring her a glass of water and asking after her mother. He had known her mother's name too. He had known where she was staying. She looks terribly frail, Miss Boyd, he had said gently. I hope she's taking care of herself. He had spoken those words in the same warm voice. He had patted her shoulder when she stood to leave. 23-year-old Delaney Boyd had walked out of that building and stood on the sidewalk of Federal Street, knowing exactly what he had meant. She had gone home. She had taken her father's case file from the back of the closet and read it at 2 in the morning. She had found a signature, and then she had closed the file. 3 months later, her mother suffered a stroke in the kitchen. For 4 years, Delaney had told herself it was hypertension, genetics, bad luck, anything at all, because the only remaining explanation was one she could not survive believing. Standing in the conservatory among the dead plants, she realized that she was standing in exactly the same place she had stood 4 years ago. The same kind man, the same gentle words, the same hand resting on her shoulder. There was only one difference. Last time she had run. And upstairs, in the bottom drawer of the dresser in her room, 41 pages of documents lay waiting for someone to find them. This time, Delaney Boyd did not run. She stood there until darkness swallowed the last of the daylight, and when she finally stepped out of the conservatory, her hands had stopped trembling. On the evening of the 20th day, Delaney called her brother at 8 o'clock, just as she did every night, standing at the bend in the second-floor hallway, where the signal was strongest. The phone rang 9 times before going silent. She called again, 9 rings. Silence. She stared at the screen for a moment before dialing the hospital's main line. She listened to the hold music for 3 minutes and 10 seconds. During those 3 minutes and 10 seconds, she told herself that Rowan was asleep, that he'd left his phone in the physical therapy room, that this had happened before more than once, and every single time, everything had been fine. The operator's name was Melissa. Her voice sounded young and exhausted. She asked for the patient's name. Delaney gave it. Melissa typed something into her computer. Then came a pause, the kind of pause that has a shape of its own. The patient has already been transferred, ma'am, Melissa said at last. Transferred where? Delaney asked immediately. The records indicate that he was transferred to another facility at 2:15 this afternoon, 6 hours ago. No, Delaney said. That's not possible. I'm his sister. I'm his legal guardian. Nobody notified me, Melissa typed again. Then she spoke the sentence that changed everything. And she spoke it in the voice of someone reading words on a screen, rather than speaking to another human being. The transfer was processed through a power of attorney clause embedded in the debt acquisition agreement. Ma'am, I never signed such a clause. No, ma'am, but the creditor executed an emergency medical relocation order under the primary account's default terms. A beat of silence. The creditor signed the authorization. After those words, something began ringing inside Delaney's ears, a long, white, shrill sound that seemed to drown out the world. She asked where Rowan had been taken in a voice she no longer recognized as her own. Melissa apologized and informed her that she was not authorized to disclose that information to someone without the proper clearance. She sounded genuinely sorry. Perhaps she genuinely was. Delaney hung up before she finished speaking. Then she ran. She ran the length of the second-floor hallway. 3 members of the household staff flattened themselves against the wall as she passed. She didn't knock. She shoved the door open with both hands. Sullivan Rourke sat behind his desk. Across from him sat a man in a gray suit she had never seen before. Both men looked up. Delaney stood in the middle of the room and screamed. For the first time in her life, she screamed at a man who carried a gun. "Where is my brother?" The man in the gray suit shot to his feet, one hand moving instinctively toward the inside of his jacket. Sullivan lifted 2 fingers perhaps an inch above the desk. The man stopped. He sat back down, then he rose, walked out of the room, and quietly shut the door behind him without a single word. Sullivan looked at Delaney. "What happened?" She told him. Her voice broke halfway through, and she hated herself for it. She told him that Rowan had been transferred 6 hours earlier. She told him that the creditor had signed the authorization papers. She told him that he was the creditor. She told him that he had taken her brother somewhere, and that nobody would tell her where he was. Sullivan said nothing. He picked up the desk phone and dialed a short number. He spoke 3 sentences. He listened. Then he hung up and dialed another number longer this time. He spoke the hospital's name, the date, the time. Then he fell silent for a long moment while someone on the other end read something aloud to him. Delaney watched his face as it happened. She saw it. She watched the color slowly drain from Sullivan Rourke's face, little by little, like watching the tide pull itself away from a rocky shore. And she realized that this was the most terrifying thing she had seen during her 20 days in this house, more terrifying than the guns at the gates, more terrifying than 19 men storming the kitchen, more terrifying than the story of Route 127, because this man did not go pale, either. He lowered the receiver gently back into its cradle. Without looking at her, he said quietly, "A transfer authorization was submitted at 1:40 this afternoon." He paused. "It bears Harborline Holdings letterhead. It was notarized, properly filed, completely legal. Who signed it?" Delaney asked. Sullivan was silent. Then he answered. "I did." She simply stared at him. "What did you just say?" "On paper," he replied calmly. "The signature at the bottom is mine." "Then you did this." "I did not. That is your signature." "Yes, then who?" Silence. And that was the moment everything finally broke. Because Delaney had lived in this house for 20 days, and she had learned how to read Sullivan Rourke's silences. She knew immediately, absolutely, beyond any doubt that he knew. He knew who had done this. He knew the man's name. He knew exactly where that person was tonight. He could pick up a phone, and within 40 minutes the entire situation would be resolved in precisely the same way everything in this house had always been resolved. And he was not going to say a word. She asked again, this time very quietly. "Who?" Sullivan lowered his eyes to his right hand, the hand whose 3 fingers no longer fully straightened, and said softly, "Miss Boyd, I need you to go back to your room," he continued. "I will find your brother. He will be fine." He said every one of those things in the calm voice of a lake, 30 meters deep. And not once did he answer her question. Then Delaney understood something else, something colder still. He wasn't remaining silent because he was protecting someone. He was remaining silent because if he spoke that name aloud, here in this room, in front of her, then he would have to do something about it. And after 14 years, he still wasn't ready. She turned and walked toward the door. Her hand closed around the doorknob before she stopped. Then she looked back at him one last time. He was still sitting beneath the warm yellow light, one hand resting on the desk, the man whose name was spoken in whispers throughout Boston. And somehow, tonight, he looked smaller than she had ever seen him. "You've been silent for 14 years, she said quietly. She stopped for a moment before continuing. "I always thought that silence only killed the people in your own family." Then she opened the door and walked out. Sullivan Rourke remained alone in that room. Outside, the season's first rain tapped softly against the windows, and tomorrow was Thanksgiving. Delaney did not sleep. At 4 o'clock in the morning, she went downstairs and began working, because working was the only thing she still knew how to do. She spread the amber tablecloth across the long dining table. On the first floor, the same table from the photograph. Beneath the same tall windows, she arranged the candles. She hung the maple wreath on the front door. She polished 40 wine glasses until not a single fingerprint remained. She performed each task with steady hands and an empty mind. Every 15 minutes, she checked her phone. Nothing. At 7 in the morning, Sullivan sent her a message containing 4 words, "Still searching." Nothing yet. By 9 o'clock, the guests began to arrive. Delaney stood at the far end of the dining room, holding a wine decanter, and watched them enter. Only then did she understand that this was not a family dinner. There were 40 people, nearly all men, dressed in dark suits. They did not hug each other, they shook hands. They came from 5 different branches of the family and seated themselves in 5 separate groups, leaving invisible spaces between them that no one crossed by accident. There were no children, no loud laughter. There were amber linens, candles, maple wreaths, and an enormous turkey on the table. And beneath all of that, this was an annual board meeting, wearing the costume of a holiday meal. Grady Finnegan arrived at 9:20. He shook everyone's hand, smiled warmly at each guest, and remembered every man's wife's name. Maeve was brought downstairs at 10. Odette supported her arm. The entire room rose to their feet at once, all 40 men standing together, without a single word being spoken. And Delaney understood that, in this world, the small woman wearing a blue cardigan still meant something, even after 3 years of silence. Maeve took her seat at the head of the table, where she had sat every year before. Wine was poured. Then she stood up. The room fell silent. Odette instinctively reached toward her, but stopped short of touching her. Maeve Rourke stood with both hands resting upon the table and looked down at the silverware before her. Then she began rearranging it, slowly, precisely. She lifted each piece and set it down according to some invisible order, adjusting the spacing with painstaking care, performing the task with the solemnity of someone doing the most important thing she would do all day. 40 men watched in silence. Delaney recognized the movements immediately. She had watched them every afternoon after lunch for 21 days. Only now did she realize this wasn't a tray. This was the real table. Maeve moved to the place beside her and arranged the next setting. Then another, and another. No one dared sit down. She completed 4 place settings before stopping at the 5th seat, a space where no chair stood. She paused. Then she reached forward and carefully arranged what wasn't there. Her fingers touched the amber tablecloth exactly as they always did. An invisible spoon. An invisible fork. She stepped back half a pace and looked upon it with the expression of someone who had finally completed a long overdue task. Behind her, Ambrose Pike began counting softly. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then he reached 5 and could not continue. 40 faces turned toward him. His voice broke. The voice of a man who had not allowed anyone to hear a single flaw in 40 years finally cracked. "She's setting the table for 5, he whispered. "There are only 4 of us left. She is still waiting for her daughter, and perhaps for the friend she lost 50 years ago." Delaney stood at the end of the dining room, holding the wine decanter, and stared at the empty place. And she understood. For 3 years, every afternoon after lunch, in that room overlooking the bay, Maeve Rourke had been setting the table for her daughter. She had never forgotten that Nell was dead. She had been doing the one thing she had been denied 14 years ago, when the Thanksgiving table had already been set, when no one sat down, and 9 days later an old man quietly cleared it away at 4 in the morning. No one in this house had realized it for 3 years. Not because they lacked eyes, because no one had ever looked. Sullivan Rourke stood and walked toward the table. He said nothing. He simply pulled a chair from against the wall and placed it carefully in the empty 5th space. Then he pushed it gently toward the table and returned to his own seat. Maeve looked at the chair. Then she sat down. Dinner began. Near the end of the meal, they observed a tradition this family had practiced for 30 years. Each person stood and spoke one thing for which he was grateful. The sentiment traveled around the table in short, restrained statements: gratitude for health, for prosperity, for a successful year. Then it was Grady Finnegan's turn. He rose to his feet. He lifted his glass. He smiled that warm, grandfatherly smile and said that he was grateful that this family knew how to forgive. For 30 years, he said, we've sat at the same table because we've learned how to overlook one another's faults. Then he turned toward the far end of the room, where Delaney stood holding the wine decanter. And isn't it funny, he continued lightly, that the young woman who set the table you're all sitting at today has a father who used to keep our books. He spoke the number, $4 million. He said that Thomas Boyd had died in a prison cell in Nashua. Then he looked at Sullivan, still smiling, and asked, "You let a rat's daughter stand beside your mother's chair?" 40 faces turned toward Delaney Boyd at exactly the same moment, and the wine decanter in her hand did not tremble. That was the worst part of everything that happened that day. Years later, when she thought back on it, that was the only thing that ever made her want to cry, not the insult, 40 pairs of eyes staring at her, but the fact that her body did not react at all. 4 years of humiliation had trained it to believe that this was normal, that this was simply weather. And if she stood perfectly still, it would eventually pass. She stood straight. She met their eyes. Her hand remained as steady as stone around the decanter. Then she looked toward Sullivan Rourke. He was already looking at her. 1 second. 2 seconds. The entire room waited. 40 men waited. Ambrose Pike waited. Odette Vasari waited, one hand resting gently on Maeve's shoulder. And Sullivan Rourke said nothing. There were 40 people in that dining room, and no one moved. The third candle from the head of the table burned crookedly to one side, because someone had opened the window that morning and forgotten to close it again. Grady Finnegan was still standing, his wineglass raised at chest level, the smile still resting comfortably on his face. He did not lower his hand, because lowering one's hand was something people did when they had finished speaking. He was waiting. On the opposite side of the table, Sullivan Rourke sat perfectly still. His left hand rested upon the amber-colored tablecloth, fingers stretched out, unmoving. His right hand could not be seen. It was hidden beneath the table, from where Ambrose Pike stood, half a step behind Sullivan's chair. It was visible. The hand opened, then clenched. 3 of its knuckles had never fully straightened, and so when it formed a fist, it closed unevenly. The tendons across the back of his hand rose into pale white cords beneath the skin. It remained that way for 2 seconds. Then it opened again. Then it clenched a second time. Ambrose Pike lowered his eyes. He had stood behind that chair for 40 years. He had watched that hand since it had been too small to hold a spoon properly. He watched it close into a fist for the second time, and he knew exactly what would happen next. He knew it would happen in approximately 4 seconds. And he knew that in this room there were 40 people, 5 branches of the family, 3 men carrying recording devices without the master's knowledge, and a 76-year-old woman seated at the head of the table only 2 meters away. He said nothing. He did not reach out. He simply looked down at that hand, then lifted his eyes and shook his head once. Very slightly, so slightly that only one person in the entire room saw it. The hand beneath the table stopped halfway through its movement. It opened slowly, 1 finger at a time. Then it settled onto Sullivan's lap and did not move again. Sullivan Rourke remained perfectly still. He did not look at Ambrose. He did not look at Grady. He did not look toward the far end of the dining room. Instead, he stared at the third candle burning crookedly in its holder and said nothing at all. Grady Finnegan waited for another heartbeat. Then he lowered his glass, smiled, and sat down. At the far end of the room, Delaney Boyd carefully placed the wine decanter onto the buffet table. She did it so gently that it made no sound. Then she lowered both hands, smoothed the front of her apron, and bowed. It was a perfect bow, precisely the correct angle, precisely the proper duration, exactly as one was taught during the first 3 months of service. It was the bow of a servant, acknowledging an entire room before quietly leaving it behind. None of the 40 people present saw anything unusual in it. Then she turned her back and left through the servant's door. She climbed the stairs. The sound of her footsteps faded somewhere on the 2nd floor. The 40 guests continued their meal. Pictures of gratitude resumed. Plates were passed from hand to hand. Someone told a story, and 3 men laughed softly into their chests. The turkey was carved and divided. At the head of the table, Maeve Rourke did not touch her food. She sat with her back perfectly straight, both hands resting upon the amber tablecloth, looking at no one. She looked only at the 5th chair, the empty one. She looked at it for 1 hour and 40 minutes, until the last guest finally rose from the table. That night, at 4 o'clock in the morning, in the small room on the eastern wing of the house, Delaney Boyd folded 2 sets of clothing. She folded them carefully, 1 crease at a time, just as she had done for the past 4 years. When a person owned only 2 sets of clothes, they learned to fold them properly. She placed them inside her canvas bag. She packed the picture frame as well, still turned face down. Then she took out the letter from the inner compartment, the letter addressed to Ashgrove House. Number 14 Harbor Lane, the paper, now softened and wrinkled after being opened 11 times, and countless more after that. She placed it upon the pillow. Then she tore a page from the small notebook in which she kept track of her expenses, the notebook, whose first page bore nothing but the number 1 and the days that followed beneath it. She wrote a single line in pencil. Please tell Mrs. Maeve that Nell is sorry. She placed the note beside the letter. The bottom drawer of the dresser remained closed. She did not open it. Delaney climbed to the 3rd floor. The door to Maeve's room was lined with rubber padding and made no sound when opened. Maeve Rourke was asleep, lying on her side facing the window, One hand tucked beneath her cheek like a child, Delaney stood beside the bed for a moment. Then she reached out and gently placed her hand against the old woman's forehead, the same gesture her own mother used to make on nights when she had a fever. Maeve did not wake. Delaney withdrew her hand, stepped back into the hallway, and quietly closed the door behind her. She descended the servants' staircase, the staircase reserved for the staff. At the gate, the night watchman looked at her, then at the canvas bag resting upon her shoulder. He said nothing. He simply pressed the button. The iron gates slowly swung open, and Delaney Boyd walked out of the house she had entered 21 days earlier. She walked 800 meters toward the main road in the darkness. It was not raining, and it was the 22nd day. By 6 o'clock in the morning, when Odette discovered that Delania's room was empty and found the letter resting upon the pillow, everyone in the house understood the same thing. Ambrose Pike stood in the doorway, looking at the 2 sets of clothes that were no longer in the wardrobe, and said quietly, "She ran." The night watchman reported that she had left on foot, alone, carrying nothing but a canvas bag, heading toward the main road at 4:10 in the morning. Sullivan Rourke received the report at 6:20. He said nothing. The man delivering it remained standing, waiting for an order that never came, and eventually left the room on his own. Everyone believed she had run away. She had not. Delaney Boyd stood at the bus stop on the main road from 4:20 until 5:40, alone in the darkness. She never sat down because she was afraid that if she did, she would fall asleep. She took the earliest bus back to Boston. She arrived at Haymarket shortly before 7. She stepped into a small cafe that opened early and spent 15 minutes in the restroom, changing into the cleaner of her 2 outfits. She combed her hair with her fingers, washed her face with cold water, and stared at her reflection in the mirror, thinking that no one would believe someone who looked like this. Then she walked to 1 Courthouse Way. At 8 o'clock that morning, Delaney Boyd entered the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Massachusetts. She had not come to accuse anyone. She had spent the entire night calculating that decision while sitting on a cold bus stop bench, and she understood her position with painful clarity. What did she have? A signature on a 4-year-old civil authorization form, something any lawyer could explain away in less than 4 minutes. The testimony of a 68-year-old man whom she had neither the right nor the heart to drag into this matter. A photograph with a scratched-out face belonging to a woman who had died 14 years ago in an accident that had long since been closed. It was not enough for anything. Not enough even to justify a phone call. She came to do the one thing she had been afraid to do for 4 years, the one thing any citizen had the right to do, and that she had never dared. She filed a request for a review of a case that had been closed in 2022. Defendant, Thomas Boyd. Charge, embezzlement, disposition. Defendant deceased while in pretrial detention. She wanted only one thing to reclaim her father's name. Nothing more. She sat in the 4th-floor hallway for 3 hours. They informed her that walk-ins had to wait. She simply replied, "That's fine. I can wait." She waited until 11:15. Then a clerk called her name and led her into a small office overlooking the parking lot. The woman sitting behind the desk was named Marguerite Hollis. She was 58 years old, her salt and pepper hair neatly tied back, and she had spent 26 years sitting in that room or rooms exactly like it. She had heard thousands of stories like this one: the daughter of one man, the wife of another, the mother of a 17-year-old boy. They all said the same thing: "My father didn't do it. Something isn't right. Please look at the case again." She accepted the folder and said, "You have 15 minutes." Delaney laid the 41 pages she had printed the previous night upon the desk, along with a handwritten summary she had drafted while sitting at the bus stop, her handwriting shaky from the cold. Marguerite Hollis began flipping through the documents. She flipped through them quickly the way people do when they believe they already know what they are about to read. She was polite. She was tired. She nodded at all the appropriate moments and murmured, exactly when courtesy required it. Delaney watched her do so and realized that she had already lost before she ever walked into the building. And in the back of her mind, she heard the familiar voice that had spoken to her for the past 4 years. "See? I told you so." Marguerite Hollis turned to page 7. Then she stopped. Page 7 was a copy of the account authorization form, bearing the bank's seal and dated March of 2019. There were 2 signatures in 2 separate boxes, The lower box bore a bold, sweeping signature. She said nothing. She read it again. Then she read it a third time. Delaney watched the woman's index finger come to rest upon that name and remain there. The small office was filled only with the hum of the heater and the sound of a car reversing somewhere in the parking lot outside. Marguerite Hollis slowly set the file down. She removed her glasses. She folded them carefully and placed them neatly upon the desk. She performed each movement much more slowly than necessary. And Delaney suddenly realized she had seen that gesture before in a kitchen, when a red-haired woman had poured coffee more slowly than necessary before telling her not to ask that question inside that house. Then Marguerite Hollis looked up, and she looked at Delaney Boyd, with eyes entirely different from the ones she had possessed 15 minutes earlier, eyes that had awakened, sharpened, and discarded every trace of polite indifference. "Miss Boyd," she said quietly. She paused. Then she asked, "Where have you been for the past 3 weeks?" That afternoon, Marguerite Hollis did not wait for an answer. She picked up the desk phone, pressed 4 numbers, and said only 3 words, "Room 702. Then she hung up. For the next 4 minutes, neither of them spoke. Delaney sat there, staring at her father's file, still open to page 7 on the desk of a complete stranger. Then the door opened. 2 men walked in without introducing themselves. One of them set down a hardbound file nearly 5 times thicker than hers. They moved her to another room, a windowless one. Someone brought coffee. She didn't touch it, and then they began showing her things. The first photograph was of the iron gates of Ashgrove Point, taken from across the bay through a long-range lens. September 2018, the second photograph showed the same gates. 2020, then the third, the fourth, the fifth, 6 years. For 6 years they had been sitting on the opposite side of the bay, operating out of a rented house whose owner had no idea who his tenants really were. They had photographed every vehicle that entered and every vehicle that left. They had the names of all 40 people who had sat at Thanksgiving dinner the day before. They even had photographs of Grady Finnegan shaking each guest's hand on the front steps. Then they slid the final photograph across the table. A thin young woman stood before the iron gates in freezing rain, her ash-brown hair plastered to her face, clutching a canvas bag against her chest. The first Monday of November. Beside it was a screenshot of Bus Route 9's scheduled departure time, arrival time, every stop along the way. They knew when she had entered. They knew how she had entered. They knew what she had been wearing. Marguerite Hollis folded her hands together and said quietly, "Over the last 6 years, 112 people have walked through those gates." She paused before continuing. 73 of them belonged to us. The remaining 39 were guests, and not a single one of those 112 people will ever walk back out and made their own way to One Courthouse Way. She looked directly at Delaney. "We've been waiting," she said. For 6 years. Delaney Boyd sat in that windowless room and realized something that changed the shape of everything she thought she was doing. She was no longer a 27-year-old woman filing a request to reopen her father's case. She had become the only thing they had failed to obtain in 30 years. Marguerite Hollis spoke gently. "We need you to go back." "No," Delaney said immediately. "I'm not going back. I understand, Miss Boyd," and somehow the kindness in her voice made it worse. Then Hollis opened another page in the thick file before her. "Your brother is currently being held at a facility we have not yet been able to identify. We've been searching since 10 o'clock this morning. The transfer authorization was filed at 1:40 yesterday afternoon under Harborline Holdings. It is entirely legal. The receiving institution is listed only under an identification code belonging to a private network that is not legally required to disclose the locations of its facilities." She looked up. "Do you honestly believe that's a coincidence, Miss Boyd? You walked out of that house at 4:10 this morning. Your brother disappeared the day before. Someone prepared for you to be sitting in this chair long before you ever arrived here." Delaney rested both hands on her lap. For a very long time, she said nothing. She stared at the untouched cup of coffee growing cold in front of her and understood perhaps the cruelest truth of the past 4 years. 22 days ago, she had walked into a cage she was not allowed to leave. This morning, she had walked out of it under her own power, 800 meters, through the dark, and had walked straight into another one. This cage had windows overlooking a parking lot. It had central heating. and it had a gray-haired woman speaking to her with perfect courtesy. It was legal, that was the only difference. She asked the only question that mattered anymore. "If I cooperate," she said quietly, "who can you protect?" Marguerite Hollis did not lie to her. Years later, when Delaney looked back on that day, she would be grateful for that. Because for the past 22 days, every kind man and woman she had met had lied to her in warm voices. "Your brother," Hollis answered. Then she stopped. "And no one else." "What about Mrs. Rourke?" Silence. "She's 76 years old," Delaney continued. "She's the only living person who was inside that house on that night, in November of 2012, and knows what happened to Nell Rourke. If you reopen that case, if her name appears on a government document bearing your seal, what do you think will happen to her?" Delaney held Marguerite Hollis's gaze. "Do you want her to live?" she asked softly. "Or do you want her to die?" Marguerite Hollis did not answer. Instead, she pushed a single sheet of paper across the table. Delaney stared at it for a very long time. Then she picked up the pen and signed her name. She did not sign it for justice. She had stopped believing in justice. On the morning, Stracers arrived at 6 o'clock and took her father away, in front of the neighbors. She signed it because somewhere in this state, there was a 19-year-old boy inside a building. No one could identify a boy who had no one in the world except her. And as she set the pen down, while the others in the room began discussing procedures and secure lines of communication, and 100 other things she did not hear a single word of, one thought came to her. It was so cold that her fingers tightened around the edge of her chair. 14 years ago, a 22-year-old girl with ash-brown hair had sat in a room very much like this one. She too had believed that if she told the truth, everything would finally stop. She too had signed something, 3 weeks later, on Route 127. In the rain, with no witnesses, she died. Delaney Boyd had just done exactly what Nell Rourke had done. And the 76-year-old woman upstairs, the woman who still set a place for a 5th plate after lunch every single day, had been the only person in the world who had known, from the very beginning, how this story was going to end. That same morning, 25 miles away, in the gray stone house perched on the point of land, 3 doors opened over the course of a single hour. The first door opened at 9 o'clock. Ambrose Pike knocked twice and entered without waiting for an answer, a thing he had never done in 40 years. He walked to the desk and placed a sheet of paper upon it. Sullivan Rourke was already seated there. Delaney's letter, the one Odette had found on her pillow and brought downstairs at 6 that morning, lying before him. Now there were 2 letters resting side by side on the polished wood. They were identical, the same heading, the same paper, the same printed text. They differed by exactly 7 words. "I changed 7 words," Ambrose said quietly. "For 40 years I have never lied to you once, Mr. Sullivan. This is the first time." Sullivan did not look at him. He simply stared at the 2 letters. "Why?" he asked. Ambrose Pike stood perfectly straight, both hands resting on the back of the chair before him. "Because," he said, "your mother has not spoken a single word in 3 years. You paid for 7 doctors, 2 specialists in New York, and another one in Zurich. Not one of them understood that she doesn't need medicine." He paused. "She needs a reason." Then he said the rest, his voice calm and matter of fact. "And because I'm dying, Mr. Sullivan, they told me 18 months. That prognosis was given last April." He smiled faintly. "I don't want to die in a silent house." For a long time, Sullivan Rourke simply stared at the 2 letters lying beside one another. The old man waited. He had prepared himself for every possible outcome. He had prepared himself to be cast out of the only home he had known for 40 years. He had prepared himself for things far worse than that. He had carried that boy in his arms before the child had even opened his eyes. And he had calculated, perhaps foolishly, that the man would never kill him. And he had also calculated that perhaps he was wrong. But Sullivan said nothing. He merely sat there, one hand resting upon the desk. He neither ordered the old man to leave nor asked him to stay. He did not ask another question. It was the 2nd time in 2 days that he had chosen silence. The first silence had cost him a young woman standing at the far end of the dining room, holding a crystal wine decanter. This second silence cost him something else. It cost him the last look Ambrose Pike ever gave him before turning away, a look that contained something the old man had never allowed anyone to see in 40 years. It was not fear. It was disappointment. The second door opened at 9:20. It opened with a kick. Odette Vasari did not bother knocking. She marched into the middle of the room and threw a stack of papers, clipped together with a metal binder clip, onto the desk. The file slid across the polished wood and stopped beside the 2 letters. "This was in the bottom drawer of her dresser," she said. "It wasn't locked. I opened that drawer every Friday to put away clean towels." She knew that. Sullivan opened the first page, then the second. He read quickly, his eyes moving over columns of figures with the ease of a man who had spent his life reading balance sheets and financial statements. He stopped on page 7, at the box containing the bold, sweeping signature. The signature of a man who had signed his name 1,000 times and never imagined anyone would one day stop to read it. He did not move. Odette stood before him, her red hair still unbrushed, still wearing the nursing scrubs from her night shift. When she spoke, her loud Brooklyn voice carried unsoftened through the room. Out in the hallway, 3 members of the household staff had stopped walking. None of them dared continue. "For 3 weeks," she said, "I've watched that girl sit beside your mother's bed and feed her 1 spoonful at a time. Your mother would only eat if music was playing, so she sang to her. Do you know that? She sang through every meal, every single meal, for 21 days. She brushed her hair. She trimmed her fingernails. Every night she called her little brother and lied to him, telling him everything was fine. And afterward she sat on those stairs, unable to cry. I stood at the end of that hallway and watched her." She pointed a finger at him. "And so did you, Mr. Rourke. I know you were standing there." Then she jabbed her finger toward the file lying on his desk. "And what did you do? You sat in this room counting the money of the man who murdered your sister." The room fell silent. Odette Vasari was 44 years old. 6 years ago, she had buried her only son. From that day onward, there had been nothing left in this world for her to fear. That was why she was the only person in that entire house capable of asking the next question. "How much longer are you planning to stay silent?" Then she turned around and walked out of the room. She did not bother closing the door behind her. The Boston Federal Courthouse was nearly empty on the day after Thanksgiving. Only a security guard sat at the lobby desk downstairs, while the fluorescent lights hummed along the 7th floor hallway, because no one had thought to turn them off on a day when no one was supposed to be working. Delaney Boyd stepped out of the deposition room after 4 hours. Her throat was dry. She had spent that entire time recounting the last 22 days of her life to 2 men and a tape recorder. She told the story slowly, and they had made her repeat 3 different parts that she herself had thought were unimportant. She stepped into the hallway and stopped. Sullivan Rourke was standing there. Alone, there were no men accompanying him. No one in a gray suit standing 3 paces behind him. No black wool coat that all of Boston had learned to recognize from a distance. He wore only a dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. His hair was uncombed, and beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, for the first time since Delaney had met him, he looked exactly 36 years old. He did not walk toward her. He simply waited for her to cross the length of the hallway. Then he held out his hand. Resting in his palm was a small black USB drive. "What is this?" she asked. 30 years, he replied. "Names, dates, accounts, everything that's been recorded since my father sat in that room." He paused before adding quietly, "including me." Delaney stared at the USB drive in his hand, but made no move to take it. "Why?" she asked. And what took her breath away was not its cruelty, but its honesty. For 22 days, every decent man she had met had lied to her with a warm voice. Sullivan Rourke did not. "Don't think I'm doing this for you," he said. "Then why?" "Because he signed my name." He looked down at his right hand, the hand whose 3 knuckles had never fully straightened, and said, "For 30 years I've managed to keep exactly one thing that belongs to me. My signature." And he took that too. Then he fell silent for a long time. Delaney waited. At last he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "And because you did what I couldn't do for 14 years. He looked directly at her. "You were the first one to open your mouth." Then he knelt. It was not a marriage proposal. There was no ring, no speech. Nothing about the gesture resembled what people imagine when a man kneels before a woman. Sullivan Rourke knelt, not in defeat, but in silent surrender, stepping closer and holding the USB drive out between his hands as if offering her his entire life on a silver platter. He placed it gently into her palm, his fingers lingering for a fraction of a second against her skin. It was a silent surrender, more absolute than any physical bow, leaving his fate entirely in her hands. The security guard at the far end of the hallway saw it happen. He stood up instinctively, then slowly sat back down because he had absolutely no idea what he was supposed to do with what he was witnessing. Then the elevator doors opened. Ambrose Pike stepped out, leaning on a cane he had never used in 40 years and had only begun carrying the morning before. He walked toward them slowly. He looked at the man kneeling on the stone floor, said nothing to him, and then turned his gaze to Delaney. Then he turned to Delaney and said, "There is one more thing, Miss Boyd, and I am the only person still alive who knows it, so I have to tell you before I no longer can. Your mother was not a servant in that house. Cora Boyd was Maeve's piano teacher and closest confidant. She arrived in September of 1974 3 times a week at first. Then she stayed because Maeve asked her to. In 48 years of living in that house, Maeve had only one true friend. That friend was your mother. In 1978, Cora left in the middle of the night. No luggage. No letter. Maeve was the one who opened the gate for her at 3 in the morning, and she stood there watching until she disappeared from sight." Ambrose paused before continuing. "That was the last kind thing Maeve would do for the next 48 years. Delaney asked why her mother had left. The old man answered quietly. Because she was pregnant. Delaney went completely still. She looked at the man kneeling on the courthouse floor. He was looking back at her. In the same second, both of them had the exact same thought, and neither dared to say it aloud. Ambrose Pike shook his head. No, that child was not from this family. He looked out the courthouse window where rain had begun to fall over the parking lot below. The child's father was a man Sullivan's father had taken care of 2 weeks later. The baby did not survive. Delaney swallowed hard. What about me? Ambrose turned back toward her, his voice barely above a whisper. You were born 21 years later, Miss Boyd. For 21 years, your mother was terrified that if she ever had a child, they would find her. She waited until she was 31 years old. She waited until she believed enough time had passed, that people had forgotten, that she had gone far enough away. Delaney asked softly, "And they found us anyway?" Ambrose Pike nodded once. It only took 48 years, 2 generations, 1 family, 1 name, the man who took away the person your mother loved, and 48 years later, someone from that very same family took your father away, and not one person in those 3 generations ever knew they had been walking the very same road. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow, even 1 step, a pause, then another. Maeve Rourke appeared at the far end of the hallway, her elbow supported gently by Odette Vasari. She wore the same blue cardigan, her silver hair neatly tied into a low bun. She walked the entire length of the 7th floor hallway of the federal courthouse on her own 2 feet. She passed her son, still kneeling on the stone floor, without looking down at him. She stopped in front of Delaney Boyd. Raising her hand, she placed it gently on Delaney's shoulder. Then she spoke the final words she had left in this lifetime. "You've come home. I've waited for you for so long." She paused, and now, I'm allowed to forget. She became the second witness. She was the only living person who had been inside that house on that November night in 2012. And she had waited 14 years for someone strong enough to stand beside her. Not strong because they carried a gun. Not strong because they possessed money. Simply someone who would not run away. 1 year later, Sullivan Rourke was serving his sentence for his past complicity in the family's financial network. Because of his full cooperation in dismantling the empire, he received a reduced sentence of 26 months. Ashgrove Point was seized and sold at auction to an investment fund, whose representatives had never once come to see the property. 4 miles away, in Marblehead, there was a small 3-story house with a dining table that seated 6. Rowan Boyd was practicing walking between 2 parallel bars in the living room, swearing with such creative flair that Odette had started writing down some of his best lines for future use. Odette was cooking while arguing with him over who had eaten the last of the bread. Ambrose Pike sat in his armchair, pretending to be annoyed by all the noise. He was still alive 18 months longer than anyone had expected, and he liked to joke that perhaps his heart was simply too afraid to stop beating, because this house was far too loud. And Maeve Rourke, her silver hair neatly tied into a bun, sat beside an old piano she had bought from a second-hand shop in Salem, teaching a wordless melody to the person sitting next to her. She remembered every single note perfectly. She no longer remembered her own name, but she remembered the song that a woman named Cora had played in that house 48 years ago. and she played it now without missing a single note. It was Thanksgiving Day. When it came time to say what everyone was thankful for, it took a very long time at this table because everyone kept interrupting one another. Maeve looked around the table. She counted the chairs. Then she pointed to the last chair, the one with a plate already set before it. Though no one was sitting there, "Who is that place for?" she asked. Delaney Boyd looked out the window, where the season's first snow was falling slowly over the small garden outside. "It's for someone who still has 14 months before he comes home," she said softly. Hanging on the living room wall was an old framed photograph, a Thanksgiving dinner from long ago, 4 people. Amber-colored table linens, candlelight. The face of the ash-brown-haired girl had been scratched beyond recognition. No one restored it. No one hid it away. It simply no longer lay beneath a mattress. Outside the gate, beneath a thin layer of ice, stood a small brass plaque engraved with 2 simple lines. As H. Grove House 14 Harbor Lane, the real house. The very address written on the original letter, from the very beginning. The letter, 7 words, had been changed by the hand of an old man who did not want to die inside a silent house. Delaney Boyd had never gone to the wrong house. She had simply arrived 48 years too late, and 26 months too early. If this story has touched your heart in any way, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it with someone you believe needs to hear it. Every day, we bring you heartfelt and compelling stories just like this one. We would truly love to know how you feel about Delaney's story and Maeve's journey. Who do you think was the most tragic soul in that house? Could you forgive Ambrose Pike? Please leave your thoughts in the comments below and share what is in your heart. We read every single comment, and they are the reason we continue telling these stories. We wish each and every one of you listening today good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day that lies ahead. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in our next video.